As mentioned by Jason, the title of my talk for today is A Timbre of Early Blackface and the Making of Black Americana. I initially I had actually planned I wrote a whole other talk initially that I now feel like I want to work more through, and that talk is on sort of thinking through the contemporary resonances, right, of Black string band Americana traditions and music, particularly through various figures like Jake Blount and Don Flemings and the Carolina Chocolate Drops, and as well as some of the larger historical figures that have been in many ways erased from the legacy of sort of mainstream understandings of what Americana and bluegrass and string band music is. But in that project, I realized that, again, some of these artists are themselves scholars, and so thinking about scholar practitioners like Jake Blount, et cetera, who do this work, I felt that I wanted to add a little bit more something to the conversation rather than just sort of doing a history, because I think you can find those resources already. So I actually want to ground this in my work on Blacksound and my work on Blackface, to think about the ways that early sort of iterations of string band music develop, both in the folk context, but as well as through the commercialization of Blackface, and then how those lines sort of continue to unfold in the way that music and sound is racialized, as well as how we conceptualize of the sort of genres and ideas and aesthetics connected to Americana and string band music. So I want to think about the relationship between the violin or fiddle, the banjo and dance, and the bones in particular in early popular folk music styles in America, as well as within Blackface, and how this sonic relationship became racialized as a white bluegrass tradition, while considering its origins that reveal the silencing of Black history and presence within the sound and timbre of Black string band music, and what we often refer to as Americana. This presentation will briefly consider the texture of string band music and its relationship to the legacy of Blackface, again with a particular focus on the violin, banjo, bones, as well as dance, and I will do so through the case of a historical figure by the name of William Henry Master Jubilain. I also want to place the discussion within my concept of Black sound, which I define as, quote, the sonic complement and embodied legacy of Blackface minstrelsy and performance that serves as the aesthetic, racial, political, and proprietary basis of American pop music. The sound is based on the real and imagined performance of African Americans that were amalgamated along with the sounds of other ethnic groups, yet primarily under the control of white music industrialists for most of the 19th and 20th centuries. Black sound is not synonymous with Black space sounds, okay, two separate words, or the music of Black people, the music produced out of Black people, right? Although many of these diverse aesthetics are included within the circulation and performance of the concept of Black sound, capital B, one word. Instead, again, Black sound is understood as the sonic basis of all U.S. American popular commercial music and its derivatives. While the sonic development of Black sound over time might influence the music-making practices of Black Americans and the way their performances are treated commercially, the creative practices of Black people continue to develop apart from and alongside, much like Black bluegrass traditions, their circulation within various genres of American popular music. This is the context in which string band music and Blackface minstrelsy developed alongside one another as folk and commercial streams of music that shaped one another in various ways, while also maintaining their own distinct styles. So to think first about the violin, which is an instrument that I myself studied, right, as my musical training, the four-string violin or fiddle of both Celtic folk and former European traditions was introduced to and quickly mastered by African-American musicians throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. I should also say that my discussion of the fiddle, especially in the Black tradition, is especially indebted to the work of Dr. Jacqueline Collins, JJ. So in addition to multiple ethnographic accounts that note the importance of Black fiddlers on plantations throughout the South, many contemporaneous accounts of entertainment and sporting halls point to the presence of an African-American fiddler in many districts of entertainment throughout urban areas, especially in the developing later part of the 19th century. The fiddle was not only performed in these settings in a traditional classical melodic style, but also served a particular rhythmic and ragged function that helped to ground the dance that it often accompanied. It is worth noting that the fiddle was already part of Celtic traditions under the pressure from English conquerors against harps and bagpipes. The violin was a noted position for an enslaved person on plantations throughout the South, and although a bowstring instrument within the violin family already existed in Africa, particularly the single-string fiddle, the fiddling traditions of Black Americans were impacted by the violin of their enslavers and others from the United Kingdom and Europe. Not only was the enslaved Black fiddler required to provide entertainment for the house on the plantation, but also for celebrations as well as harvest festivals and other commodity-driven needs during slavery. Fiddlers in the South also developed their own idiosyncratic style, performing for mostly Black gatherings on plantations or in segregated settings in other parts of the country. Thus, as with the jig, reel, and other dances that were improvised or ragged upon by interactions between Anglo-Celtic and Anglo and African customs in America, we might conclude that the fiddling styles of mid-century popular music, which were popularized through Blackface minstrelsy, were also directly impacted by the improvisational, polymetric, and polyrhythmic musicking practices of Black fiddlers. Black string players were frequently served as house musicians in establishments like Almack's, which is a famous Black-owned sporting house in New York City in the Tenderloin district, where William Henry Master Jubilain, who I'll talk about in just a second, was spotted by Charles Dickens in 1842 on his trip to the United States. The scripts and remnants of Black sound practices might still be heard in the fiddling styles of white and bluegrass and other fiddlers and string bands in the Piedmont and Tidewater regions of the United States. William Henry Master Juba Lane. The origins of Lane are mostly speculative. As a free Black person, there are no records that say exactly where or when he was born, but contemporaneous oral histories claim Long Island, New York as his birthplace. A young William would have traveled some distance to the Five Points Vice District in downtown Manhattan, where Charles Dickens saw him perform. Marion Hannah Winter, who helped to recover the once infamous dancer from the annals of history, suggested that Lane studied as an apprentice of Uncle Jim Lowe in Long Island. Lowe was described as a Negro jig dancer of real and, quote, a Negro jig and reel dancer of exceptional skill, whose performances were confined to saloons, dance halls, and similar locales outside the regular theaters, end quote. Juba's dances began to amalgamate with the jig and other folk dances of the British Isles in the colonial and early antebellum eras. The origins of Juba, an African-based performance practice, its use as a name for a skilled Black performer on and off the plantation, and its fusion with the Irish jig define the ways in which the capabilities of Black expression, often labeled as excessive, were scripted into stereotypes and onto Black people's bodies through blackface. At the same time, these expressions were taken into the body of white performers and their own simultaneous expression of the self and other through blackface. The term jig in the United States became so influenced by Black performance practices, often caricatured in blackface, that it became popularly and in many ways negatively associated with African Americans throughout the 19th century. In the Federal Writers Project that took place between 1936 and 48, formerly enslaved C.B. Burton of South Carolina suggested the jig as a dance of African Americans on the plantation. Quote, "We danced and we had jigs. Some played the fiddle and some made whistles from canes, having different lengths for different notes and blowing them like mouth organs," end quote. Dance scholar Brenda Dixon Gottschild notes that, quote, "The Juba jig is characterized by qualities of body postures, non-vertical alignment, exaggerations in the bend of the knees and openness of the legs that are, from a European standpoint, grotesque and awkward. It is open-ended in duration and improvisatory in vocabulary. We can see some of these movements being implied in these wood cuttings, right, of William Henry Lane that appears in the London Illustrated News in one context and in a U.S. periodical in the other. So frequently it is characterized, that is the Juba dance, right, by patting, slapping, clapping, and otherwise rhythmically using body parts as musical instruments for percussion and syncopation, characteristics that were formalized in a dance called Pat and Juba. So I'm taking time here to make sure to put timbre in conversation with movement, especially as we're thinking about early Black folk music, because much as we discuss, or much as the history of Black string band music discusses, as well as string band music in particular, is that it was used for dancing, right? And so right away, we already have the relationship from a corporeal and a movement and a sonic standpoint, right? Between the body, between the jig and movement, as well as we'll see between the sort of making of percussive sounds using the body, including the feet, which then leads to tap dance, right? In a particular stylized manner. So movement, sound, timbre, all of these things are connected in the way that I'm trying to sort of unpack their development. So furthermore, the Juba dance is described by Solomon Northup, who was also a violinist. There were many, the violin became a very common instrument among Black people, especially during slavery. Frederick Douglass was a violinist, and his grandson, Joseph Douglass, was a concert violinist who at one point began to, but became a well-known Black violinist, in particular in study with Joseph Joachim. All right, so enough of my asides here. Let me make sure to stay in my script. The violinist, Solomon Northup, notes that it was performed, the Juba dance, or patent Juba, quote, by striking the hands on the knees, then striking the hands together, then striking the right shoulder with one hand, the left with the other, all while keeping time with the feet. And that, quote, the acquisition of a sophisticated rhythmic sensibility, end quote, was of the highest importance to African Americans. In My Bondage and My Freedom, 1855, philosopher and abolitionist Frederick Douglass describes music and his experience on the plantation between Christmas and the New Year, when enslaved people were allowed by enslavers to celebrate various activities. Here, Douglass suggests the rhythmic play of Juba, right, as an aesthetic, not as the name of When You Hear Me Lane in this case, and how it is derived from a performance practice known as Jubilee beating. Frederick Douglass goes on to say that, quote, the fiddling, dancing, and Jubilee beating was going on in all directions. The latter performance is strictly Southern. It supplies the place of a violin or of other musical instruments and is played so easily that almost every farm has a Juba beater. The performer improvises as he beats and sings his merry songs, so ordering the words as to have them fall pat with the movement of his hands, end quote. And I'm leaving these images up here because also one of the things that I have to do in my own practice is to look for sound, right? Or to explore sound in a moment in which there were no sound recordings. And so thinking about the relationship between how movement is described in many racist ways by white observers, thinking about the observations of Black people, right, African Americans, Africans in America on plantations who describe in their own words these movements, right, and how these things relate to one another, right, leaving these images up allows us to sort of imagine, right, the type of movements and sounds that might have been associated with Lane's dancing. So although the fiddle was prominent in local halls as well as, I'm sorry, I skipped a part. Okay. So the texture of Blackface minstrelsy is critical to reimagining Lane's polymodal performance, its impact on the minstrel stage, and popular culture in the US and UK overall in the mid-19th century. Patent Juba, as discussed above, was one of the rhythmic, harmonic, instrumental, and vocal practices developed by Juba in his performance. Lane's full-body style was performed in concert with the fiddle, as well as minstrelsy's primary instruments, the bones, banjo, and tambourine. So white minstrels, right, of British, Irish, English origin, as well as of other European backgrounds, right, took up instruments that were commonly associated with Black people, especially on plantations, as well as in the urban North, and used them to stereotype within Blackface, but yet still, right, we're developing musical practices on these instruments through this form. And so, right, it's a very complex sort of situation happening here that both is about how it limits ideas of what certain sort of performances of Black space sounds are, while at the same time developing, right, American musical practices through these very same tropes. So while copious accounts of Lane's performance primarily focused on his dance in relation to these instruments, he was also described as a noted vocalist and tambourine virtuoso. A reporter from the London Illustrated News remarked on Lane's overall musicking performance in England, where the master performer appeared as a tambourine player and dancing with white serenaders, which was a blackface troupe. So let me just be clear that William Henry Lane, with G.W. Pale Serenaders, a very famous blackface troupe of the mid 1840s into the 50s, was one of the few blackface performers to exist in the mid 20th century, even though, as I mentioned, there were many black street performers who influenced, white minstrels. Lane was one of the few blackface stars, and he became one of the first international, black pop stars as he traveled from the United States to the United Kingdom with Pale Serenaders and was a sensation, so much so that it said he performed for Queen Victoria, all sorts of manner of aristocracy, as well as in London's major halls like Vauxhall, right? And so we're talking about one individual performer who completely helped to reshape the way that bodies, Victorian puritanical bodies, were moving and imagining themselves through popular culture, but also through the derisive nature of blackface, okay? The quote goes on to say, but Juba, I'll leave the quote here up for a while for you all to kind of peruse, but please do still here, so I'll leave it there. But Juba is a musician as well as a dancer. To him, the intricate management of the inward tambourine is confined, and from it he produces marvelous harmonies. He almost questions whether, upon a great emergency, he could not play a fugue upon it. In this sensational account of Juba's performance of Black performers' practices in African-American dance styles, the critics suggest that harmonies might have been produced from the tambourine and that on that instrument, Lane might have even performed a fugue. In a contemporary Western conception of the tambourine, it might seem like this is a hyperbolic statement. Again, I'm trying to sort of unpack ideas of how sound and even notions of timbre, the individual idiosyncratic sound of a particular instrument or voice, began to emerge. But in considering the many descriptions of Juba's polyrhythmic, syncopated, and virtuosic performances, it is possible that the critic was describing, within the Anglo-centric tools that he had available, what the audience witnessed on that London stage. As Winter notes in her study of Juba, his dancing was compared to that of the bones and the banjo. The comparison highlights that in addition to the rhythm produced by his feet, his overall performative style, including innovative harmonies, vocalizing, melodies, and non-melodic instruments, varied rhythmic practices, and other performances that were deemed to be unique to Lane, but were actually characteristic of a variety of folk practices of African-descended peoples, okay? An 1848 description of Juba's performing in London Vauxhall attempts to capture the rarity of his performance style within British culture, as he tries to paint a picture of the polymodal, expressive performance style of Lane. I'm not going to read it out loud here because it's a long quote, but just take a second to kind of look through here. I will look at some of the references to timbre. It is a laugh, it is a laugh distinct, a laugh apart, a laugh by clear itself, trying to get into the timbre of the laugh here, clear, ringing, echoing, resonance, harmonious, full of rejoicing and mirth and fervent fun. You might hear it like the continuous humming sound of nature, permeating everywhere. It enters into your heart and you laugh sympathetically, right? He also, down to the bottom here, such mobility of muscles, such flexibility of joints, such bounding, such sliding, such gyrations, such toes and such heeling, such backwards and forwarding, such posturing, such firmness of foot, such elasticity of tendon, such mutation of movement, such vigor, such variety, such natural grace. Clearly, right, these writers were blown away by this novel, new, improvisatory, virtuosic performance that they saw Lane produce. And just at the top here, is that in the, right? There is a new company of Ethiopian serenaders headed by the distinguished Pale, the Sultan and Singers, and the Bonaparte of Bones. All right, I want to also highlight that. We'll come back to it. And so in terms of this is just giving us a bit of a sense of what Lane's movement might have resonated like in performance, right, in real time, and how his movement is inseparable from the sounds, right, that were being produced through this texture of blackface, which itself, right, was being sort of derived from more localized folk practices that incorporated the banjo, the tambourine, and bones, and the fiddle, right? But I want to put a little pin in this idea of the Bonaparte of bones, because the bones, I feel like, is one of the aspects rhythmically of blackface minstrelsy that is less discussed or under theorized. I'm very much a fan and follow Don Fleming, the right of the Carolina Chocolate Drops, who discusses his own reintroduction to the bones, right, particularly through a former student of a virtuosic, trailblazing bones player named who was referred to as Brother Bones, aka Freeman Davis, who was also a virtuosic whistler, who also did the theme song for the Harlem Globetrotters. And so I want to give us a chance, right, to engage with the timbre of Freeman's vocal performance through whistling, as well as through how the rhythmic play of the bones, right, might have also shown up, right, in these improvisatory performances that we might have to imagine of William Henry Lane. So what we can glean from here, we can take this clip and view it, right? And in your attempts to describe what you're witnessing, and also remembering that this is Freeman Davis performing 100 years almost after William Henry Lane introduced his idiosyncratic performance styles into the mainstream of commercial blackface, right? 100 years later, we still have Freeman Davis in a sort of Hollywood nostalgic presentation of old blackface through this movie, Yes, Sir, Mr. Bones. We have Freeman Davis, not himself in blackface, because William Henry Lane also, once he toured in the United Kingdom, it was said that it was actually his genuine blackness, right, that was attractive to white audiences, as he, not through blackface, but still through the larger tropes and limitations of blackface, introduced these styles that, you know, they attempted to describe, and we might imagine ourselves attempting to describe, you know, within our, you know, more traditional modes of musical analysis, what actually is happening on stage in Freeman Davis's very virtuosic, rhythmic performance through whistling as well as through the bones. So in the whimsical description that we read before, tinged with exoticism, fascination, and fantasy, the writer makes it clear that Juba was a star attraction of the show. The author attempted, like many after Charles Dickens, to put into words the astonishment that white observers experienced when witnessing William Henry Lane on stage. It is made clear that Black performance was not new to the viewers, but that Lane was unique in his skill and ability. There are moments in this passage that point not just to the fascination that they had with the Black entertainer, but to some of the distinct practices that influenced the making of Black sound and blackface in the United States and United Kingdom. In particular, description of Lane's sound and voice, e.g. the echo and resonant, full of rejoicing and mirth and fervent fun, and so on, marked what Samuel Floyd describes within vernacular Black vocal practices, quote, in vocalizing that is variously rough, sandy, piercing, and falsetto, and the use of wordless sounds for their own value rather than for the communication of verbal meaning, and the ease of movement from speaking to singing mode within a musical context, and then the use of ululations, grunts, hums, shouts, and melisma as integral and indispensable parts of the musical meaning, end quote. So as lanes, I'm going to stop sharing now because that's in the slideshow. All right. So as Lane's performance is often described as indescribable or indiscernible in the white press, it is possible that what he was communicating was the vernacular language of Black dance and improvisation upon British American folk dances was drawing directly from a system of African-influenced musical practices that still carried aesthetic power to white viewers. It did not matter that they were mostly unable to recognize or interpret them as a particular school of dance or thought that carried its own set of meanings. This reviewer and many like him described Lane's flexibility of muscles in his attempt to capture the complicated rhythmic performance of his sound and movement. While at the same time, the description almost sounds as though Lane is out of control, wild, and non-human, as part of the legacy of the Jim Crow blackface character type. These properties of Lane's Black sonic and corporeal aesthetics were beyond the descriptive capabilities of the observer, but they were critical to the reception of his performance, even as they were scripted through blackface. Yet, as Ali Wilson notes, the approach to the organization of rhythm is based on the principle of rhythmic and implied metrical contrast. This is a quote. There is a tendency to create musical structures in which rhythmic clash or disagreements of accents is the ideal. Cross rhythm and metrical ambiguity are the accepted and expected norm. So much of what we get in the inability for, again, white European American observers in the 19th century to describe the rhythmic complexities of what they were hearing, as Ali Wilson suggested, comes from the fact that this idea of the normalization of certain rhythmic practices led for the performances of Lane, right, coming from his African-derived aesthetics, to fall outside of a particular category of analysis that was even capturable through language, right? And we still find that as a challenge in how we think about and approach analyzing music outside of the Western canon today. So the poly and cross-rhythmic practices of African-descended peoples might sound like an uncontrolled display of personhood and body through music, particularly in blackface under slavery. But it's important to understand that these practices are part of a system, one that changes and develops over time, and that one must have cultural practice and relationship to their community to properly engage. To this end, in her discussion of Black dance in early America, Katrina Hazard Donald suggests that, quote, the challenge posed by the fiddler caller, familiar to West Africans, calls upon the dancer to perform difficult combinations of steps. The best performers are those who can meet the challenge while maintaining control and coolness. In the African aesthetic, balance is achieved through the combination of opposites. Although dancers may be performing a fury of complex steps or figures, they must never lose equilibrium or control. This principle of asymmetry as balance can be observed among many West African groups, end quote. Lane, as a Black American trained in Black vernacular dance and other American styles of dance in New York, introduced styles that might have been foreign to white American and British audiences. The aesthetic power and described asymmetry of Lane's musicking were still felt and absorbed by the many performances and participants who were impacted by his act. So many of the advertisements of Juba's performance, we've talked about the violin, we've talked about the band, the bones, and now we're going to get into thinking about the banjo. So many advertisements of Juba's performance in America and Britain were also sure to point out that Thomas F. Briggs accompanied Juba on the banjo and the plantation dance. Briggs was a white American banjo minstrel performer. It was also within this plantation dance coda, according to many of the reviewers, that Lane was most recognized and encored for his innovative performance practices. As the banjo was central to both the formal and the aesthetic aspects of blackface, it is important to consider, its African origins and how its performance practices might be read in relation to the idiosyncratic, polymodal, and rhythmically expressive qualities of Lane's music and dance. So the banjo, originally an African instrument, was commercialized in the United States through mostly white minstrels, many of whom who learned or copied their practices from African Americans. Anyone familiar with the study of early American music, organology, and the banjo in particular, know that Celia Conway has been very influential in her study of the banjo and its African roots for a long time. The banjo, because of its relationship to minstrelsy and because of the sort of commercial impact of minstrelsy on the development of other styles of music became directly associated, right, with white people, right, of a particular class and demographic and region, right? And again, that is because of the sort of commercial development of the banjo out of blackface, and then how it begins to impact and shape different community and identity formations around musical styles that themselves incorporated the banjo into their repertoire. The banjo was still considered a novelty instrument among Anglo-Celtic Americans in the 1830s. After the British banned drums in their American territories in 1740, the banjo, particularly within the United States, became one of the primary melodic and rhythmic instruments of African American life. Originally constructed using a hollow gourd, early Black banjo techniques were also taught to Irish indentured servants in the Tidewater and Appalachian regions of the United States after the Revolutionary War. The African origins of the banjo, its polyrhythmic performance practices, and early African American banjo performance vis-a-vis Anglo-Celtic folk styles have heavily influenced the overall sound, form, and development of blackface throughout the 19th century, as well as the development of bluegrass and Americana styles of string band performance that also developed, right, along their own lines, right? So we both have the overlap and relationship between the blackface commercial style and the folk styles, but these things also developed, right, in their own ways as well. Today, the banjo is frequently associated with the bluegrass and country styles of rural white Americans throughout regions of the South and the Appalachian Mountains. The instrument, however, as pointed out, has a sonic and performance history that begins with early colonial enslaved African Americans concentrated throughout the Piedmont, Tidewater, and mountain regions of Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina, where I am from originally. The banjo is the Americanized version of the African instrument, often written as banjar by colonial white observers. As the instrument became more hybrid in its construction, its naming varied until banjo took hold in the mid-19th century when it became commercially manufactured. As banjo scholar Cecilia Conway notes, the cultural exchange that eventually led to the banjo becoming a symbol for Appalachia began on the coastal plain and moved along the waterways into the Piedmont. During 1774, the Carter Plantation on the James River between Jamestown and Williamsburg, two young white boys, Ben Carter and Harry Willis, became fascinated with several African musicians. These schoolboys exasperated their tutor, Philip Fithian. This evening in the schoolroom, which is below my chamber, several Negroes and Ben and Harry are playing on a banjo dancing, end quote. This is still within Cecilia's words. By 1781, the banjo had moved beyond the coastal plains into the upland South, where Thomas Jefferson observed its use by African musicians. The instrument proper to them is the banjar, which they brought hither from Africa, end quote. So as I've discussed so far, the history of the banjo in the United Kingdom is also directly connected to blackface minstrelsy. The famed American banjoist Joel Walker Sweeney, who was claimed to have learned banjo techniques from enslaved people on a Virginia plantation. Most of these early banjo players have direct relations, right, to Black musicians. And we can also extend into the 20th century with the development of country and bluegrass, where people like Jimmy Rogers, right, are clear about the impact that very specific Black musicians had on their styles of guitar playing, right, and string playing in general. So Joel Walker Sweeney, who helped to popularize and standardize the banjo as we know it in many ways today, traveled to the UK in 1943, where he spent almost 2 years touring successfully around the country, both with minstrel troops and as a solo act. Once Sweeney became a blackface sensation, as Dina Epstein notes, quote, the banjo became associated exclusively with the minstrel theater in the popular mind, and its African origins were forgotten. Likewise, the bones, triangle, and tambourine were part of the caricature of Blacks that white men created to entertain other white men, end quote. Dina Epstein's Sinful Tunes is another really significant book, right, with it helping to recover some of the early musical practices of Black Americans, many of which have been erased or, reconstructed in different ways throughout history, popular history. Sweeney was a white Virginian who claimed to have learned his banjo playing from enslaved Black people as a youth. Many minstrels use this as a commercial point of sort of claiming a certain level of authenticity, right? But at the same time, we can glean, the sort of impact of the direct reference that some of these white minstrels had to enslaved Black people, especially throughout the South. from an exploitative standpoint. It was noted that, quote, several old and reliable farmers in Appomattox related to me how Joe would hang around with the Negroes, learning their rude songs and playing an accompaniment on this rude instrument, and how he used to construct others. He finally made one and getting hold of some strings, very soon learned to play almost any tune on it, end quote. Sweeney learned, adapted, and continued to spread the downstroke method, an African-American influenced style of banjo playing. He then instructed many of the developing minstrel troops and stars of the 1840s, particularly the Virginia and Christie minstrels. These were some of the most popular blackface troops who would tour the country and then tour the United States and United Kingdom, again, effectively developing and spreading the first original form of commercial entertainment through the United States and creating a through line, right, of popular entertainment, consumption, and performance between the US and the UK, way before, right, the 20th century when we sort of think of that model being developed. So again, this accompanies the movement of enslaved bodies across the Atlantic. The sounds do as well. Okay. It was not until the advent of Sweeney's popularity in blackface and the subsequent dissemination of the early banjo techniques among blackface troops that the instrument and its African aesthetics were dispersed among a larger population of working class whites in the mid-century. As blackface troops like the Virginia Minstrels traveled throughout the Northeast, Southwest, and United Kingdom, they also carried with them the stylized form of banjo playing that heavily derived from Sweeney's Irish-American adaptation of Black American styles of downstroking. All right. So blackface minstrels attempted to gain cachet as more respected performance acts within middle or upper class audiences leading up to the Civil War. The influence of European classical styles began to impact many of the folk Afro-Celtic styles that defined the genre in its antebellum gestation. The standard construction of the modern banjo known today developed through the use of metal in the instrument's manufacturing, the upplucking technique and addition of frets that gained traction among blackface minstrels in the 1850s, the addition of the fifth high string to increase melodic variety, as well as the closing of the banjo's back, pardon me. As blackface performers and mountain musicians continued to perform on the banjo throughout the 19th century, the polyrhythmic, ragged, and improvised style that derived from African-American banjo performers continued to impact the hybridity of the instrument and its sound during minstrelsy's mature phase. No documents survive that discuss or have the capacity to really translate Juba's performance along with the banjo and musical detail, which seemed to have been most of his improvised African and popular acts. As such, the readings I provide, of African diasporic musical aesthetics capture the essence of what registered as novel to white audiences and performers within his own sounds and movements. Master Juba's Black performance aesthetics became absorbed into the bodies and minds of white performers and patrons who observed, consumed, and commercialized his innovative musical practices as he performed both in and out of blackface through Blacksound. Ali Wilson's discussion of the heterogeneity of Black sounds in his brief survey of conceptual approaches to Black music describes the amalgamated process as, quote, there is a common approach to music making in which a kaleidoscopic range of dramatically contrasting qualities of timbre in both vocal and instrument music is sought after. This explains the common usage of a broad continuum of vocal sounds from speech to song. I refer to this tendency as the heterogeneous sound ideal tendency. This is Ali Wilson in Black Music as an Art Form from Black Music Research. The downstroke, claw hammer, or beating method of early Black American banjo playing became central to the polyrhythmic, syncopated, and corporeal-based performance styles that came to dominate many strains of American pop sound. Excuse me. Similar to how dynamic rhythmic variations and metrical shifts sounded from the African-American bodies who padded Juba, the African-American downstroke style of banjo playing encouraged similarly varied rhythmic and bodily movements during improvised moments of pop music making throughout the 19th century. In describing the techniques of the downstroke method, Cecilia Conway notes that the striking down away from the thumb with the nail of the forefinger or the right hand rather than plucking, right, performers achieved a sound more energetic and propulsive, more conducive to movement and dance. The forefinger, which is curled toward the palm, is held relatively motionless with respect to the hand, and the motion of the hand in striking the strings originates at the wrist and is more or less circular. As the fingernail makes contact with one of the strings, the fleshy part of the thumb comes to rest on another. Thus, this method is well suited to non-arpeggiated melodies with pitches changing at 16th note time intervals and is associated with up-tempo banjo songs and fiddle tunes, both of which often accompany contemporary dancing, The downstroke method is also significant because of its rhythmic emphasis on the weak second and fourth beats of a 4-beat measure. In the up-picking style, often attributed to Anglo-Celtic Americans and the influence of European guitar playing, melodic variation or arpeggiation take precedence over rhythmic development, and the rhythmic emphasis tends to fall on the strong or 1 and 3 beats of the measure. The presence of the drone string, however, on the early banjo and subsequent variations of the instrument throughout the 19th century also displays its African origins. But the way in which the shortened high string was used in 19th century banjo performance reflects what method is being employed. In the downstroke method, the drone string is unstopped, serving to both ground and vary the rhythmic line, while the up-picking technique often plucks and stops the drone, adding the possibility for melodic variety along with the other 4 strings. Significantly, it was not until after the popularization of the banjo through Blackface that the up-picking method of Anglo-Celtic Americans became a prominent style of banjo performance. As slavery remained concentrated in the Upper South during the colonial era, the banjo circulation and downstroke performance style generally remained between enslaved blacks and the mostly Scots-Irish whites, in which they had contact, which is why you find the downstroke method of banjo performance quite present still in string band and Americana styles of performance, especially those that are directly influenced by the legacy of Black banjo playing. But as slavery spread throughout the U.S. South with the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 and the eventual outlaw of slave importation in 1808, the regional practices of Black banjo playing spread and became even more prevalent throughout the nation during the early antebellum era. Consequently, the incorporation of the banjo into Blackface minstrelsy resulted not only from a caricature of typical Black plantation life, but also from the direct cultural interactions, albeit within unequal systems of power, i.e. slavery, right, between Blacks and whites in the Upper South during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So to close here, the fictional Black sounds and movements scripted in Blackface performance became regarded as natural, realistic displays as Black individuals. These scripts assigned to Blackness were racialized by ethnic whites who choreographed their perceptions of Blackness into Blackface, even if they were based on some acts of Black performance. By choreographed, I'm referring to the way in which an individual's voice and vocal timbre and instrumental performance are constructed through various psychological, cultural, and physiological factors, yet imagined as naturally performed from their bodies. As musicologist Nina Eidsheim states, quote, I hence propose drawing on concepts from dancing choreography, a theoretical analysis and framework that can address voice as a product of both societal shaping and individual articulation and materiality, end quote. Within the vocal choreography and instrumental choreography of Blackface, right, the racialization of sound was constructed such that noise, nonsensical lyrics, scratchy fiddling sounds, the percussive and metallic sounds of the tambourine, ragged rhythmic clapping, feet packing and stomping, interjections, calls, cries, hollers from the audience and performers, snapping, whistling. These sounds were pejorative often when connected. These sounds that sort of suggest a distinct timbre, right, were pejorative, were connected to how Black Americans sounded. Although these very sounds are part of the fabric of Black sound as well as American popular sound in many ways, which was embodied and performed by white Americans in the development of subsequent styles of music, including bluegrass, country, ragtime, the blues, Americana, and beyond. I think I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morrison. We have just about 25 minutes for Q&A, so plenty of time for questions. So if anyone does have a comment or question, please use the raise hand function, or feel free to just type your thought in the chat and we'll get around to it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morrison. I really, really appreciate this, not only as like a Black string player myself, but also because of the project that I'm doing on the Tidewater area, even though it's based on hip hop musicians,
Yeah. Yeah.
Pharrell Williams, NERD. But one of the things that I am been really thinking about is what it means to try and sound these moments from the past.
Mm-hmm.
When you go in and you look at the archive and understand specifically for Virginians, Black Virginians, how certain notions of Southernness are
Mm-hmm.
supposed to be sounded.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm attempting to do that. I'm attempting to orchestrate these things for the dissertation album that I'm creating.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to know if you could still help me get a little bit clearer on the difference between Black sound space and Black sound,
Absolutely.
because I think I'm having, a light bulb moment,
Yeah.
but it's just
Yeah.
not quite there.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that question, Danielle. I'm very excited about the work you're doing. And I think I'll just say, just around your dissertation project, and as you're thinking sort of historically about that region, right? There's just so much to be said, about why the Tidewater produced, right, and produced the people that it did, right? I mean, Missy Elliott, come on, right? It's a whole thing, and I think it has a lot to do, right, with particular developments around rhythm, around timbre, around ideas of what it meant to like make music in those spaces, right, that then continue to impact musical developments over time. So very excited about that work. But thank you for asking, because I didn't do a lot around Black sound in this particular talk, because I really wanted to kind of highlight and unpack talking about the sounds and timbres as much as possible. But I try to be very explicit, especially in the book now, because one of the questions that one of the things that I realized is that people were equating Black sound, right? The concept, the idea that I have tried to sort of develop, capital B, one word, proper noun, right? We're thinking initially that Black sound as a concept was the same as all of the sounds produced by Black people. Okay, so the distinction between Black sound and what I'm saying as Black, one word, space, then another word, sounds, right? So literally just the sounds produced by Black people, is that Black sound is interrogating a very specific sonic, aesthetic, and cultural phenomena, right? And that is the development of American popular sound out of the legacy of Blackface, and then how that unfolds over time. Now, this is the trick, though, Danielle. Within Black sound are Black sounds, right? So, so this is why Black sound requires an analysis at every step, because it is not just sort of like one general definition that could be applied overall. One has to actually unpack what is going into the making of Black sound in particular moments, right? And so, for example, with William Henry Lane, I'll give you an example. I'll continue to use that here. What I'm suggesting is that William Henry Lane is already having to negotiate, right, an idea of, one, what the sound of Black people were, right? Just the sounds produced, having to negotiate that just through the colonial lens, right? Just through the legacy of slavery, just through the way that Black people were beginning to be racialized, right? So he's already having to contend with how Black people are expected to sound, right? At the same time, he's also having to contend with the development of an American popular sound that is made of Irish folk tunes, English folk tunes, Scottish folk tunes, right? Native tunes, right? As well as Black folk tunes that are both real and imagined, all interpolated through the white performer, right? Initially. So that is sort of what early Black sound is, which includes some version of actual sounds produced by Black people, as well as sounds attached to Black people that they didn't actually make. Right. And so, yeah, that's and so, well, I want to be explicit, though, that Black space sounds are any sounds that come out of Black folk. So you and I, violinists, right? That's a Black sound. Okay. So that in the sense of the sounds that are produced from Black peoples and Black bodies. But just to be clear, that Black sound, one word, capital B, as a theoretical concept, is tracing a very specific sonic and aesthetic phenomena that deals with the amalgamation, right, of popular sound out of the legacy of Blackface, that is drawing on real and imagined performances of Black people, while at the same time incorporating the folk and aesthetic sounds of European Americans, and then later, Chinese, East Asian folks, as well as indigenous peoples, right, into this American sonic fabric that is still under the primary commercial control of white American men.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful.
Sure. Thank you for the question.
Hi, Dr. Morrison. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for this excellent presentation. This was really well done, and it's incredibly helpful for me as a Black banjo researcher myself. So in your description of banjo technique, particularly around like the frailing or clawhammer style, you went into depth with Cecilia Conway's description in her African Banjo Echoes and also in her archives. And something that I've been thinking a lot about has been trying to determine like lineages of playing technique, lineages of styles that creates like this Black tradition that's going on into the present day with folks like Don Flemons and Jake and all the other people.
Yeah.
And in Cecilia Conway's archives and also in a number of other archival recordings, I've noticed a variation in techniques. There's clawhammer, but there's also 2-finger, 3-finger, and finger picking happening in these folks, especially in the collections of Cecilia Conway. And I'm curious, how do you account for those variations of techniques with the understanding of that clawhammer style being like this historical precedent? How do you make account for that in the creation of Black sound and maybe even looking forward into the present day?
Yeah. Thanks so much for that. Thanks for that, Joe. I'm also excited about your work and research as well. Yes. So I think that, I'm not a banjo specialist, right? But at this point, I've done a lot of research on banjo through the secondary sources, and then I began to really try to wrap my mind around how the performance styles and techniques, through a lot of the artists, like Jake and Don, who put things up online for you to be able to like really sort of see how these styles sound in different ways. So one of the things that Cecilia Conway really suggests is that certainly in early Blackface, right, what really distinguished or what allowed for the banjo style that was in many ways African derived to really take off was the sort of use of the clawhammer method, which allowed for a particular sort of rhythmic propulsion and performance that was not as restrictive as like a up-picking or plucking method, right? Which in many ways was, as she suggests and others suggest, was more connected to the developing tradition around guitar playing and melody, right? And sort of like thinking about the significance of rhythm at the basis of the relationship between both melody and harmony and rhythmic practice, right, through the use of the banjo, right? But in terms of the variations, that's a great question, right? Because this is the thing about Black sound as a concept too, is that Black sound is not a monolith. Black sound begins again, right, with the origin of Blackface minstrelsy, because I'm accounting for the development of commercial music, but it goes through multiple permutations, right? And these multiple permutations often have to do the most with the movement of localized Black performance aesthetics into the mainstream or the popular realm. And that happens in a number of ways, right? That happens through sheet music, that happens through recordings, that happens through, people going into sporting halls, listening to Black performers, and then going and writing it down and then publishing it and then developing a whole new sort of genre based on that, right? Ragtime, okay, in many ways. And so the way that I account for the diversity of styles that we find in a lot of these archival sources. And so, I've been in preparation for sort of thinking through this version of the talk, I've been going back and looking at a lot of the sort of discussions or really just kind of the early work that was done to just say, hey, all of these recordings exist of Black players on band, in string bands, or hey, all of these, archives exist that talk about or discuss these things. And what it does demonstrate is that regionally there are different styles. So we can think about it like hip hop, right? Hip hop doesn't have a singular aesthetic or sound, right? But there is sort of a common relation between particular elements of, depending on how we want to name them, right? But then regionally, right, you have so many different distinct styles that have to do with, right, who those people are in that region, how the musical developments take place. And so I would say that, we find variations in the performance styles because you have a variation in people from place to place over time, right? But I don't want to say any more than that because I don't know how accurate it would be. It would be guessing, and I don't want to give a guess. But I can confidently say, right, that part of that is just part of what it means for different musical styles to develop in different regions. And then we may, I would be maybe sort of looking specifically, okay, so what about the sort of banjo technique that we find in the Tidewater? And then also I feel like banjo players would probably be able to give a more concrete answer on that too, which is why I'm not trying to, make a large statement. But again, I do think that the sort of variation has to do with the way that you find various performance variations in different regions and different communities as people also are engaging in a similar musical practice.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Morrison.
Sure, thank you.
Oh, hi. I have a question about, thinking about Black sound, but I guess my research is really centered on looking at whether Black heavy metal, hardcore, and punk musicians can be included in this conversation. Now, I think that I'm wondering, like, my research is kind of interrogating the description of Black music as a musical category, and kind of arguing that, especially in the last couple of years, where we've seen more Black alternative musicians coming through the ranks, like, where do they fit in this conversation? Because the music, the sonic properties of the music that they are creating is predominantly perceived as white-centric music genres. Yet you are having a lot of groups coming up that are kind of they're incorporating like Black vernacular-isms or Black issues into kind of like this, really aggressive music properties.
Right.
And I'm using Blacksound in my research, but I'm kind of flipping it around a bit because I'm wondering if we can call I think that right now young Black people who are interested in heavy metal, for example, are seen as, that is cultural co-optation. That is in some ways a weird reversal of minstrelsy in itself, because they're performing what is commonly perceived as white music, even though the history of heavy metal is a subgenre of rock and roll, which is
exactly.
So exactly. So I don't really have a question for you, but just more of an observation as to how can we talk about, especially these new and contemporary musical transitions that we're seeing, and also why in your observations or of your opinion, it seems like there's a reluctance. I know that there was a recent Lenny Kravitz interview that came out last week, and there was a lot of pushback in relation to him as a rock musician not really being covered in Black media publications and award shows. So I'm wondering if you have any observations generally about that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm excited to learn more about your work as well. And research. So yes, it fits what you're asking fits squarely right within the sort of larger conceptualization of Black sound. So the reason that Black sound itself, as it currently stands, is a 19th century project. I'm dealing specifically with the development of sort of an American commercial music market, just as we get into the advent of recordings that then becomes a foundation of our commercial music market, right? But to your point, I teach this, and so even though the project itself is based in the 19th century, the way that I think about it is much more extensive, right? And so you're helping me to sort of be able to give an example of what it means for, right, on the one hand, Black sound, capital B, one word, to be the basis aesthetically, sonically, property-wise, and in these ways of how we negotiate race of American commercial music, right? Because the way that heavy metal has been racialized and conceptualized and commercialized, right, as a specifically white genre, it goes all the way back, right, to the practice of sort of repositioning Black vernacular performance styles through blackface, through interpretation of sort of white aesthetics into a sort of American genre that is removed from its Black context in the first place, right? So what happens in the heavy metal context, because also, I mean, we all of these sub-genres that we get out of different styles, we could start in 1956, right? In terms of heavy metal, right, in its origins. We could start in 1956 with why am I'm blanking on the I put a spell on you. I had to get the melody in my head. So we can start in 1956. I put a spell on you with shock rock, right? We are Alice Cooper, Marilyn Manson. My man Screaming Jay Hawkins was already doing that through what? The blues, right? That is also the aesthetic basis of rock and roll, as you know, and I pointed out, that then also continues to shape developments that happen, right, in heavy metal. So we could think about someone like Tina Bell out of Seattle, who has been erased from the whole sort of legacy of grunge, right? But whose voice was directly shaping the way that a lot of the white grunge rockers, younger white grunge rockers, were imagining themselves. And so even within heavy metal, we don't even have to extrapolate, right? We can go directly to the source of how some of these genres began to be imagined to even find, right, examples of majorly influencing musicians. But without even having to do that, right, we can still deal with the process of the making of Black sound, in which, right, certain sounds are racialized and commercialized and marketed as such to a particular demographic, and then we begin to invest in those sounds, right, as how we imagine our own individual selves, how we imagine others, and entire communities rally around them over time. So think about the emergence of hillbilly music, for example, right, that becomes country and western, right, Jimmy Rogers and such, the Carter family. Well, we also know the Carter family and Jimmy Rogers were working along with, taught by, performing with very influential Black musicians who were playing music of a very similar sound and style. But what happens, it becomes commercialized as, and then sort of in a larger, sense of how capitalism functions and how the market functions, right? And then how those things connect to race, become believed as and embodied as, very specific racialized genres and ideas. And so yes. I don't know if I answered your question, but yes, thank you so much for that. And let's definitely talk more.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matthew.
Of course.
I guess I have two small historical questions for you. The first, I'm really intrigued by what you were saying about clawhammer technique and how just the physicality of executing clawhammer places an emphasis on 2 and 4, or sort of shifts the focus of the beat away from 1 and 3 onto 2 and 4. I wanted you to sort of maybe kind of expand that thought and sort of extrapolate forward historically a little bit. Because it strikes me, I mean, in many ways, I'm sort of thinking about the idea of backbeat in, really starting like with R&B, and I mean, from the 30s, 40s onwards. Yeah. Just a really strong emphasis. The sort of, people talk about the democratization of the beat, shifting focus from 1 and 3 onto 2 and 4. Do you see clawhammer technique as like one of the? I guess I'm just sort of thinking about other historical precedents for a strong emphasis on 2 and 4.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, Zach, because I think so. I again, as a non-banjo authority, I'm going to be very careful in my statements here. But again, as someone who has researched it quite in depth, something that I would suggest is that the banjo was a major instrument for a long time, right? And many Black musicians, right, who write about or who express certain discussions of music, especially the late 19th century, right, are clear that the banjo was like the transitional instrument, between the blues, right, and between the folk styles of music, and between but within ragtime. And so I think that in a similar way, we can think about this in the context of disco, right? So disco all but disappears, but disco is the biggest thing happening for a whole 6-7 years, right? Huge, right? Just completely shifts the way that we understand music and the market and potential for sale and all that kind of stuff. And then, these cultural things happen and it disappears. Well, of course, it does not disappear. What happens is that it finds itself embedded into so many different styles of musical culture that have already been shaped prior by disco, right? And so we have, EDM, and we have house, and we have funk, and we have all these different styles that are taking elements of disco. And I would maybe suggest that something similar could potentially happen with the banjo, because again, it was so ubiquitous for so long and was used in so many styles and was a whole band on its own, right? As we know why people, why the guitar is such a popular instrument. So yes, I do think that it's possible that the banjo and its sort of associated styles within the development of a lot of different genres at the turn of the century does shape, right, the continued emphasis on the 2 and the 4, or on just allowing for a certain type of more rhythmic dexterity, right, that comes along with.
Fortunately, I do think that's all the time we have for today. So I'd like to thank the Actor Project for sponsoring our series. I really want to thank Dr. Morrison for his powerful, informative, super thorough talk, and for all of you for taking time out of your schedule to join us. Hopefully this presentation has inspired you to learn more about timbre, orchestration, black string band music, legacy of blackface, and African and diasporic music just more generally. If these sort of things do interest you, please feel free to join, or at least follow, the Sub-Saharan Africa and Diaspora subgroup. Tour modules and other outputs from the series will eventually be available to both the public and members of Actor. Videos from each of last season's presentations are already up on both Actor's YouTube page as well as the web page for our series. I'm going to put links to those in the chat right now. And the video from Layla McCall's talk, the first speaker in this series, is also already on YouTube and the series page. Our next speaker for this season will be Dr. Ayo Oluranti on January 18th with a talk entitled Yoruba Language Tonality as Basis for Orchestration. After that talk, we will have a presentation from Dr. Braxton Shelley and potentially one more exciting speaker. So please keep an ear out for details about those. Until then, once again, thank you so much, Matthew, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you. I'm going to share very quickly Jake Blount's resource on Black string bands, just so you all have it. All right. Thank you all very much.